Our keynote this morning will be Dave Merritt. David Merritt is a riparian plant ecologist with the National Watershed Fish and Wildlife Program of the USDA Forest Service and an adjunct faculty member at Colorado State University, my alma mater, one of my alma maters. David this morning will be speaking about Colorado river supply and demand. Please welcome David Merritt.
Thanks very much. I appreciate the invitation. Thanks to Nate and Mary. It's a pleasure to be here. What an illustrious group. Really interested to talk with many of you and hear about your work. This is going to start off as kind of a general talk about the Colorado River and just some general processes. I'm going to get into some decision support tools that might be of use across a wide range of stream types around the world. But use the Colorado River as the basis for the examples that I'm going to give, and then talk about future prospects for balancing conflicting demands across the West between water in streams for ecological purposes and human demands. I wanted to start with something that most of you have been exposed to before, but it's always good to be reminded and to hear some kind of examples of the extent of development in the basin. The Colorado River Basin is the master drainage of the West. It's about 640,000 square kilometers. It ranges from the top of the Rocky Mountains at 14,000 feet down to sea level, terminating in the Gulf of California down here in the delta. It's a system of extremes, starting in high snowfields and melting down into these large rivers of the West that everybody's familiar with, the Green, and the Yampa, the Gunnison, the Dolores, a whole range of really large river systems that are unique. I mean, they're globally unique. The Colorado River is kind of an island in a terrestrial sea. It's very isolated. And as a consequence of its isolation and its unique characteristics, such as having incredibly high sediment loads because it's draining a very arid region, the water is too thick to drink and too thin to plow, as they say, and this has resulted in some very intense selective pressures that have resulted in a lot of endemism in the Colorado River system, which again makes it very globally unique. These keel-backed fish like the humpback chub and the razorback sucker, the Colorado pike minnow that can get to be as long as 1.5 meters long. These incredibly unique and interesting fish can deal with incredibly high supersaturated, hyperconcentrated flows and very big ranges in variability in river flow. Now, the Colorado River is also important as it's a home and corridor for resident and neotropical migratory birds. And it also hosts a whole cast of characters of really unique and interesting plants. And these plants possess adaptations that enable them to live in a very dynamic environment. So the Colorado River, as we all know, forms some of the deepest and most magnificent gorges on Earth. And it flows through the Grand Canyon and the canyons of the Upper Colorado, which are spectacular, and historically formed a delta that was very rich in bird life and habitat. And this is a quote from Aldo Leopold's canoe trip in the 20s through the Colorado River Delta. This isn't a picture of it, but it is flanked by the Sierra Madres, and it used to be an incredible system. So he says the Colorado River Delta extended over 2 million acres. That's about the size of Rhode Island. Rich with nutrients, brought downriver annually with tons of silt. It's a vast, flat bowl of wildness rimmed with jagged peaks. It was nowhere and everywhere. Millions of birds, fleets of cormorants, avocets, willets, yellowlegs, mallards, widgeons, and teal, beaver, deer, and jaguar, white shrimp, and totoaba migrated from the upper Gulf of California to spawn in the delta's brackish waters. Well, when John Wesley Powell first set sail on the Green River from Green River, Wyoming, in 1869, this guy is a Civil War veteran, lost his arm, led the first crew of Caucasians down through the canyons of the Upper Green and the Colorado River corridor. And at the time, when he went down the Colorado River, there was exactly, when he went down on his second trip, there was exactly one dam that is recorded in the National Inventory of Dams, and it was here in Utah. So it was a largely free-flowing and unregulated system. Interestingly enough, this explorer, one of the explorers who's been compared with Magellan and other great explorers throughout history, was also responsible for laying out the first blueprint for developing the Colorado River Basin. He recognized on his trip that this was an uninhabitable landscape without extensive water development. And he came up with estimates of how much we would need to dam and store to make the West arable. So there's the dam. Fairview Dam in Utah. Drains out of the Manti-La Sal National Forest. And if you look at the chronology of development in the basin, it's kind of startling. And so if you progress through the decades, it began with big diversions in the headwaters. This is the Grand Ditch, which is a contoured ditch up in Rocky Mountain National Park that takes pretty much all the water flowing off of a couple of valleys in Colorado, the Fraser and the Comanche Valley, siphons that water into a series of 12 reservoirs and pumps them transcontinentally out of the Colorado River Basin into the Front Range of Colorado. And that's one of our main water supplies, and it's been touted as one of the Bureau of Reclamation's most successful projects. Very early development. At this point, there are about 11,000 diversions like this in the Colorado River Basin, in the upper part of the Colorado River Basin. So to take this chronology of dams forward, you can see in 1889, there had already been a dozen or more dams. We progress through the decades, if we can. Oops. 1889, 1909, 1929, 49. This was the era of big dam building from the early 50s to the mid-60s. Tremendous number of large main stem dams were built by the Bureau. 1989, oops, and 2009 and the present. So there are presently about 1,700 really large dams, large enough to make it into the National Inventory of Dams in the basin. Most of those dams are concentrated in the upper Colorado, which is demarcated by the portion of the Colorado River Basin that's above Lee's Ferry, which is immediately downstream of Glen Canyon Dam. And there are another 700 or so down in the lower part. Those are mainly the main stem dams that block the Colorado River. You know, it was really interesting for me just going back through this history and reading that the Hoover Dam was the first in the Bureau's, well, it wasn't the first. The first was on the Salt River, but the Hoover Dam was the first of the big dams produced by or built by the Bureau of Reclamation. And it was built during the Dust Bowl. You know, the construction started, I think, in 1930. I think it was completed in 1936. It was the largest, highest dam ever built by humans. And it was a tremendous engineering feat. And it completely plugged the Colorado River. They had to divert the Colorado River in that narrow canyon to be able to put the cement in and construct this dam. So this was the first big sediment trap on the main stem of the Colorado River, the muddy Colorado River. Oops, having a hard time with this. Well, in the 60s, there was a large project called the Colorado River Storage Project, CRISP. And CRISP had several large dams associated with it. One of them was the Flaming Gorge Dam on the Upper Green River. Others were the Echo Park Dam, which never was built because of the Sierra Club protests, and that was going to be in Dinosaur National Monument at the time. The dams along the Gunnison, the Navajo Dam, which now pipes water over to the Rio Grande through a pipeline and delivers Colorado River water to Albuquerque and Elephant Butte Reservoir. The Flaming Gorge Dam was interesting because it was right in the middle of the really zealous, excited, enthusiastic era of dam building. And not only did the Bureau build this dam, but part of the plan for building the Flaming Gorge Dam on the Upper Green, so this is just upstream of Dinosaur National Monument, which is right at the border of Colorado and Utah, they decided that they were going to create a fishery. That was part of the plan for the dam. And they couldn't wait for the dam to go in to begin to start planning for this fishery. So what the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service decided to do was use ichthyocide and kill the fishes of the Upper Green River. So they went out and over a couple weeks, they set up 55 rotenone stations where they released an ichthyocide that kills all fish. And they did this over about 450 miles of the Green River. They did it from up above where Flaming Gorge was going to go in, and then they had a station set up right above Dinosaur National Monument that was supposed to neutralize the ichthyocide. So you can see these guys out here in their bikini shorts, they're draping hoses across the river, and they're allowing this ichthyocide to go in the water. And I put this low-res photo in because you can see this white streams of rotenone floating into the stream, and it would mix and it would create a white river. It interested me to hear that the park was astounded because the neutralizer didn't work, and the park ended up having about 450,000 tons of native fish belly up floating through the national monument. These are some of the Colorado pike minnow that were killed, and those are U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service guys. They invited the public to come in to the Green River at Jensen and gather fish because this ichthyocide poses no threats to human consumption. So people came, got their rowboats, went out in kayaks and canoes and gathered fish on the Green River. I only put this in there because it just shows the zeal with which we were building, and we were building with purpose. I mean, it was to allow these big cities in the most arid parts of the country to grow and to have rich agriculture in California. This was another dam that was a part of that CRISP program. This is the Glen Canyon Dam, another large sediment sink or sediment trap on the Colorado River. And this is upstream from Lake Mead, which is formed by the Hoover Dam. This formed the largest man-made reservoir in the continental United States, Lake Powell, named after John Wesley Powell. So this is a picture of the Delta today, and this is just a quote from a John McVie book that kind of resonated with me. And having been on the Colorado River and been through some of those huge rapids and these torrents and this very wild-looking river and seeing that volume of water, he says the odd thing about it is that all of its writhings and foamings and spectacular rapids lead to nothing. They lead to a large salt flat about the size of Rhode Island. The river rises in the Rockies, thunders through the canyons, and is so used by mankind that when it reaches the Gulf of California, 1,400 miles from its source, it literally trickles into the sea. So I start off with this little kind of sobering reminder of how incredibly developed and how effective we were at completely plumbing the Colorado River system. And that plumbing and that water management and that storage of sediment, trapping of sediment, had consequences ecologically. Kind of interesting that fish die-off raised a lot of public awareness about the impacts or the potential impacts of government programs. And Stuart Udall, the Secretary of the Department of the Interior at the time, actually started the wheels rolling towards an Endangered Species Act through making sure that if the federal government was going to be engaged in an activity that had that kind of an ecological impact, that there was some sort of scientific oversight for it. So this is the encouraging part of the talk, and this is where I'm going to present a couple of tools that have been developed by myself and colleagues and some tools that others have developed towards restoring, and very strategically restoring, not completely countering everything we've done, not removing all the dams, not preventing all the benefits that we're getting from this water development, but essentially strategically trying to implement flow regimes that work in a cost-benefit analysis in terms of hydropower losses, water storage losses, and providing some ecological functioning. And as a compelling, for kind of water development-oriented people, as a compelling rationale for doing this, the federal government has spent over $1 billion federal dollars on restoration and monitoring in the Southwest. And these have been big programs, like in the Grand Canyon and on the Upper Colorado River for the endangered fishes, and on the San Juan River and on the Middle Rio Grande. And these projects are largely driven by the fact that there are native species that have suffered from what we've done to these river systems. And we're compelled under the federal laws to do something about it, to prevent extinctions. And what I hope that strategic tools towards helping to restore certain components of these systems, certain processes that allow these species to exist, can be an efficient way to save money, prevent listings, et cetera. Excuse me. So this is from a summary of river restoration throughout the Southwest. And this was by Falstad, Shaw, and others from 2007. And they looked at, I think in the whole project, they looked at about 36,000 restoration projects. Within the Southwest, there were some couple of thousand. And this just shows the breakdown of what people have been spending money on with restoration projects for riparian areas in particular. Revegetation is by and large the biggest one. These others are all other site-specific, small-scale applications like excluding livestock, very important things, revegetation, exclosures, educating people, stabilizing banks, all of these things that we're all familiar with from the river restoration literature, you know, mostly small-scale projects. I was surprised to see that flow regime enhancement ended up pretty low on this list. So this is a real simplification of the range of sort of types of restoration, types of things you can do to restore some of these processes and components of these systems. Break it down into two groupings. One is active, and that's a lot of the ones in that list that are the most prominent and most expenditures of money on restoration are these active forms of restoration where people are trying to restore form. They're trying to restore the way the system looked. They're designing a Roskin C3 channel. They're you know, stabilizing banks. They're replanting plants that they think should be there. You know, it's a big tamarack stand along a river, and they're replanting cottonwood trees. And these are all very important projects, but it is a restoration of form. There is passive restoration, which I'm kind of a proponent of, which is to restore the processes that create those forms, to try to restore processes that will allow stream channels, river functions to be performed in a sustainable way based on what we can do with the joystick up at the dam. And then there's dam removal, which, again, it's kind of a hybrid here, and it's pretty active in terms of removing the dam, but it's passive in that it's restoring a lot of the processes that historically existed. And this is just an example of a dam removal along Fossil Creek in Arizona, which is a perennial travertine tributary of the Colorado. You know, remove the dam, and the processes were restored. And that was a hydropower dam. So the main things in what I'm a proponent of, this passive restoration, is flow regimes, restoring some components of flow and sediment regimes that provide for maybe a reduced channel, a reduced system compared to what it was historically, but contains some components of that former system. So part of the challenge in doing such a thing and restoring flows and achieving an attainable outcome is to have clear and attainable goals, to have a clear idea of what your reference is. And these are common in any restoration project. Examine alternative outcomes and look at the pros and cons of each. Find ways to implement in a cost-effective way through doing a cost-benefit analysis, both economic and ecological. What scientists need to provide, and all of us in this room, are robust tools that resonate with managers that can be used to forecast projected outcomes to future, you know, decisions that we make. And I think as important as anything is this ease of conveyance of the information to decision makers and to the public. Why should the public care if we let a slug of water go out to the delta in this very remote area in another country? You know, how do you convey that that's important to people? And so we have responsibilities at multiple levels, both getting people to see things interregionally, but also getting people to understand these processes and why they're important. And so anyway, there were a couple papers that I wanted to highlight that are attempts to do some of these things, to develop frameworks that can be applied across regions, that can be applied consistently, that resonate with the public, and that are efficient. And ELOHA, the ecological limits of hydrologic alteration, big group of scientists got together and talked about, look, you know, every time we have to fight a legal battle over water, every time we want to design an environmental flow standard, we go to a place and we have to examine the records and look at the historical photographs to set a reference condition, and we have to do all this stuff on a site, and then we develop a nice flow regime for that site, and then another legal dispute comes up and we've got to start all over. Is there any way to transfer the information from one site to another? And it's basically, the basis of it is to classify valley types, to classify hydrologic regimes, and to try to transfer information from areas where we have information to areas where we don't. And that's pretty much all I'm going to say about that one. We are applying that on the national forests and the headwaters of the Colorado and up in the headwaters of the Columbia up in Montana. This other method is one that I and several colleagues in the room have been working on, and I'm excited about it. It's the idea that plant species have similar traits and might respond in similar ways to what you do with flow and sediment regimes. And that rather than looking at individual species in every case and modeling flow regimes to accommodate individual species, you can group species together. Now, that's not to say that some of these models, these predictive models, for establishing flow regimes for individual species aren't incredibly elegant and important and should be maintained. But I hope I can create a compelling case for gilding as well as a complement to this. Now, this is from some of the work Pat Shafroth did on one of the real exemplary studies of environmental flow standard setting as a means of restoration along the Bill Williams River in southern Arizona. And what they did was they used the ecological function model of HEC-RAS, Army Corps of Engineers hydraulic modeling tool, and actually used the life history traits, the colonization attributes of some key riparian species, cottonwood and Gooding willow, which we know a lot about what it takes to get them to establish. And all we have to do is tweak the hydrograph a little bit to get these things to establish. And we also know what gets tamarix, the non-native invasive species, to get established. And so Pat and his colleagues basically designed designer hydrographs to try to accommodate the native species while inhibiting the regeneration of the non-native tamarix or salt cedar. Now, this idea that I wanted to put into the room, and I think you're going to hear a lot more about at this conference, is this idea of gilding. Gilding of riparian plants. So you might have a site, the Grand Canyon or the canyons of the Upper Colorado, and you might have 250 species of plants. And, you know, if you don't want to grab onto the one endemic plant or the one endangered species or the one big charismatic plant and just do all your modeling for that species, then you need to do something that gets at those other 235 species. So what gilding is founded, and it's really got a strong foundation in the ecological literature. And early plant ecologists noticed that plants have similar ways of interacting with their environment. And the selective pressures of living in an environment have created adaptive traits to acquisition of resources and dealing with disturbances. You know, saprophytic cones is an example, dealing with fire and actually requiring fire to reproduce. Storing all your carbon below the ground, like on the prairie, so that if there are fires or there are bison herds that come across, you can immediately, you know, use that carbon to regrow. So there are these common adaptations of plants to similar environmental stressors. And Philip Grime did a nice model here looking at the trade-offs between some of these adaptations. You can't have your cake and eat it too. You can't be a desert plant who can deal with being inundated for 2 weeks out of the year and produce thorns that fend off herbivores. You know, there are trade-offs between the different types of traits that plants are able to develop. Now, some of the recent pioneering work is of Julie Stromberg, who has been talking about functional types for decades and published almost 100 papers, all of which give little nuggets of information about using functional types to look at how plants respond to the environment. And she would have, I'm sure, loved to have been here today, and she would be standing here now, but she couldn't be. But I greatly respect her work. So the idea here is that for riparian vegetation, plants have similar traits. You might have a deep-rooted plant that gets down to the water table, and it's got a big, high canopy and huge evaporative losses or evapotranspirative losses, and it's vulnerable to groundwater decline if it goes below the lowest root. You've got other species that have little tiny scale-like leaves that can deal with a demanding atmosphere and essentially maintain a water balance to survive in drier habitats. You've got other plants that can vegetatively reproduce and can break off and recolonize downstream, and other plants that are shallow-rooted and very vulnerable to a slight lowering of the water levels in a stream. So the idea of gilding is to break them away from their taxonomic identification. It's no longer Acer negundo or box elder. It's no longer tamarisk. It's a set of traits like deep roots and high canopies and high water use efficiency and the ability to deal with very low internal water potentials. Oops. Well, I guess I can skip that one. That was essentially just grouping all these plants according to their like attributes. And these attributes are morphological and physical characteristics of the plants. I'm really excited about the physiological ones because those are quantitative measures of how the plant's going to respond to changes that we can actually detect and we can actually manage in terms of water. So the way we've broken plants down is into their life history attributes, their reproductive strategies. Do they produce a lot of seeds and colonize right after a flood recedes, or do they go into a seed bank and have a lot of dormancy, the ability to go dormant? Can they deal with fluvial disturbance? And how do they balance an atmospheric demand for water and a supply of water from the soil? So I'm quickly just going to buzz through these. These guilds include traits that, as a part of this gilding process, are selected because they relate to the things we can manage about rivers. They relate to aspects of the hydrologic regime. They relate to a long-term characteristic of a single site on a river. How many days a year is it inundated on average? How intense is fluvial disturbance on that site where that plant might occur, and how often does it happen? So what we do is take these traits and we basically select them based on things we know we can manage for. We can manage for, as you saw in Pat's model, you can manage with stage discharge relationships and an understanding of what mobilizes sediment and deposits sediment. You can manage for a timing of flow, a flow duration, and a frequency of flood events. And so you're picking traits of plants to put the plants into guilds based on their connections to these factors we can manage for. Reproductive strategies. We know that the weight of seeds, there's a trade-off associated with that. You know, the seeds, you can produce a lot of them and they can go everywhere, but if the conditions aren't right, they can't remain on the land and go dormant or persist for very long without dying. So that's a trade-off, an energetic trade-off that the plant has gone through adaptation. There are morphology response guilds, like growth form, whether it's an herbaceous plant or a woody plant, whether it's got a shallow lateral taproot system or root system, or whether it's got a taproot. That's how it acquires water, and it's how it acquires nutrients. And then, of course, how much you expose yourself to the atmosphere, how high your canopy is, you know, may make you more or less vulnerable to changes in flow regime, particularly drought, drying streams out, intermittent streams. Another set of traits that I feel is really important, and I'll get into this a little bit later, is the ability to deal with huge floods that might waterlog logs and ice and debris and other things, depending where you are in the world. And furrowed bark is one of those. It's like a bumper car. You know, the cottonwood trees can persist and deal with large wood during big floods, impaling them. Other plants have perennial root systems, and they can resprout following a flood. Other plants can adventitiously root, which means they can be buried, and as long as they're not buried all the way, they can root out and form a stand on top of whatever just got deposited on top of them. And these are the ones that interest me the most. These are the water balance guilds, and these are particularly important across the arid Southwest. So this is the ability of the plant to maintain a balance between the water being supplied by its roots and the demands of the atmosphere. Demands of the atmosphere exceed the water supplied, and they don't have an ability to close their stomates or deal with high water pressures inside their xylem tissues. They wilt, they yellow, they have branch dieback, and they die. So these are all really interesting to me and quantifiable. And as I'll mention in a bit, that's where I think we need to go, is quantifying these traits. So the basic concept is this. You take a list of 500 species or 200 species, and they each have a trait profile. And you group them according to their trait complexes. That's the process of gilding. And you can see in an ordination diagram there how different complexes of species. So each species is a point there, and it's grouped together along a gradient of tolerance of inundation. Or these are upper right corner, these are ones with deep tap roots. Ones on the left side have smaller tap roots. So the idea is then these characteristics relate to attributes of the flow regime. And you can actually develop predictive models that predict the probability of occurrence of a particular gild, like a disturbance-adapted, drought-tolerant gild. And you can model this out with a predictive model, and then you can determine the probability of that plant occurring if you can quantify these attributes. Fluvial disturbance and moisture availability is an example here. And you can see this is where those species really, that's the sweet spot for these species. They like a lot of disturbance, and they can deal with not a lot of moisture. And these require a lot of moisture, but really can't deal with fluvial disturbance. And so with these kinds of models, if you've got these for a landscape, you can actually make some predictions about what might happen in response to changes in flow regime. So I'm going to provide a couple of examples. This is one that is actually right now involved, or may be involved in a lawsuit. And this is a way of basically, it's a stream that has been threatened with water depletion. Cherry Creek, it's one of those precious perennial streams in Arizona, drains off the Mogollon Rim. Spring fed, goes between 20 cubic feet per second and 10,000 cubic feet per second during the monsoon season. Tremendously active, really rich, walnut forests, velvet ash, cottonwood and willow, really rich bird and reptile diversity, mammal diversity. And so the idea behind this project was to determine how much water that river could afford to give to the Salt River Project or to Phoenix or to copper mining. So the idea was, how much water does that river need to remain a river, a functioning river? So what we did was we took the list of 140 or so species and we gilded them based on their traits. And we came up with 7 gilds. And this is kind of a nice example of some of the traits that we used, depth and height of the plant. And you can see that, you know, these gilds are little tiny plants that are very shallow rooted, very vulnerable to scouring or to water depletion. Whereas these other gilds have deep roots but not high canopy, so they're probably pretty safe during drought. And these have a high canopy and not a very extensive root system, probably pretty vulnerable to a lowering of the water table, probably pretty vulnerable to depletions in flow. And so you can see that this one is actually the cottonwood and willow dominated. They have some shared traits. And this one is desert shrubs. And I'm only going to show you the example of the cottonwood model in the interest of time. So what we had at this site and what you need at these sites is some idea of the hydrology, how it's connected to stream flow. At this site we had base groundwater, and we had a very strong relationship between surface flow, stream flow, and groundwater. And we also had some really nice two-dimensional hydraulic models so that we knew at every point out on that floodplain what the depth and velocity of the water are over every single point out there, including where our vegetation plots were. So we were able to look at Gild 7 and look at its distribution. It's the green colored dots here. Look at its distribution across the floodplain. And it contained a few species. So this model contains a few species. And when we do the predictive model, we can say something about all 3 of them and about this guild of plants. And so the model produced a really nice predictive model that predicts the probability. So it's kind of like a weather forecast. It predicts what's the likelihood of encountering this Gild 7 given the current conditions out there. And then we were able to take the groundwater level and simulate what if you depleted the groundwater by ½ a meter? What if you took that much water from the stream, diverted it for out-of-valley use? What would that probably do to the vegetation? And you can see Gild 7, this cottonwood and willow gild, as you deplete the groundwater in ½ meter intervals, we've predicted an 80% loss in that forest type. Now, on the other side of that coin, we modeled those desert shrubs, and those desert shrubs really can't deal with a lot of disturbance. They can't deal with prolonged inundation. So they actually encroach down into the riparian area. So under a scenario of depleting surface flows and depleting groundwater levels, what you get is a shift from largely deciduous riparian vegetation, which is very unique in the landscape in Arizona, to desert shrubs, which are really similar to the whole landscape. And so what we provide is not, oh, you can take 40 CFS this time of year and that'll be just fine. We just basically say there's a trade-off. So you can see that desert shrubs, which are these gray bars, will increase, and you can see that riparian forests will decrease with each incremental drop in groundwater level, which is again connected to surface flow. So then a land manager, a decision maker, a judge can decide, well, you know, we're willing to permit a 50% loss of riparian forest, you know. So that's the idea behind these decision support tools, is to provide land managers not with a bunch of subjective opinions about how much water that river needs, but rather to provide them with cost-benefit analysis. What's the trade-off? Why this is important then is the next thing that scientists need to convey to land managers. And in this case, we showed that this gild, riparian, cottonwood, hackberry, cover types out on a landscape are highly related to neotropical bird diversity and resident bird diversity. And this is from field data that were independently collected, but collected in association with our plots by independent people, put the relationship together and found that the cover of that gild is highly related to bird diversity, which again, can be good or bad. We're also trying to apply this, along with a few people in this room, Daniel Sarr and Pat Shafroth and Emily Palmquist, Barbara Alston. We're working down in the Grand Canyon to try to assist with getting some projections of how alternative flow scenarios in the future could affect vegetation in the Grand Canyon. And so we've essentially, over the past months, past couple of years, gilded the species of the Grand Canyon and started to develop some models. Now, we came into this project with a tremendous database and with some real focused management goals in mind. So the Grand Canyon Monitoring and Research Center down in Flagstaff has been monitoring sandbars for 20 years and looking at the effects, the response of sandbars along the Grand Canyon to prescribed flow releases. And you know, some of those have made the news and whatnot. And that's largely to provide recreational sites for camping. But there are also, there's a committee there's a technical committee and there's a management committee that are comprised of like the Native American tribes, the Park Service, interested parties that come in and talk about what they want to manage flows and what they want to manage the Grand Canyon for. And so fish come into the mix, and you know, native plants come into the mix for Native American uses and whatnot. And so this committee gets together and comes up with flow prescriptions. Another thing that's gone on recently is they've got a new EIS, which is out for review, an environmental impact statement, to talk about prescribing flows, trying different flow management alternatives to achieve some goals downstream through the Grand Canyon. And that's pretty exciting, and you can see these hydrographs down in the lower part there. So we decided, just as a proof of concept, to go out and say, well, you know, can we use this information and capitalize on this information on these sandbars to talk about how vegetation is likely to change in response to changing flow regimes? So what we've done is developed relationships between these gilds that we've developed and characteristics that can be managed for. We've used exceedance probability, which is how often, you know, the inundation duration of surfaces. So when we have coverages that Grand Canyon Monitoring and Research Center has gathered, we've got elevations all across these bars. We can take those elevations and convert them into flow-related components and link them right up to Glen Canyon Dam and outflows, which is kind of neat. And then what we can do is take that information, develop those predictive models, and then predict future scenarios. So we've done that in just a really preliminary case, because as it turns out, the Grand Canyon actually has a pretty sophisticated, the Bureau of Rec has a pretty sophisticated model for deciding how they're going to do outflows from Glen Canyon Dam. And that model incorporates sediment, which is really cool. There's a couple of tributaries of the Grand Canyon, of the Colorado River, that contribute sediment, and they actually look at when those tributaries pulse, and they time their flow releases, their experimental floods, to maximize the remobilization and deposition of that sediment out of those side trips. And that's another really kind of progressive and innovative thing. So what we did is simulated the vegetation under a couple of the environmental impact flow scenarios. And this one had a peak flow and a relatively computerized looking kind of pixelated natural hydrograph. This one was kind of a flatlined hydrograph. And so you can really see how the vegetation, or the predicted vegetation, changes along river margins. And this can provide a really, again, a compelling set of decision support tools that you could sit with those committees and you could say, well, under this scenario, we're likely to have this proportion of that guild versus another guild, say a desert shrub guild or an herbaceous wetland vegetation guild or whatnot. And you can come up with a range of scenarios and a range of potential outcomes. And again, it's kind of like a weather forecast. It's probabilistic. It doesn't say you're going to get this guild here. It says you got a 60% chance of seeing that guild here. And then we can tally that up and say, well, odds are this is what it's going to look like.
Sorry, David, we're about running out of time. We need to...
Okay. Okay. So this is my wish list. This is a bunch of things that I'm hoping get developed with regard to guilds over the next decades. And that is to make them transferable across regions, to incorporate disturbance and sediment, to develop quantitative trait databases, and then to start to look at guild diversity. And I think we're talking about lots of plants when we convert them into trait-based guilds. So I just wanted to close by saying that the Colorado River system is already strapped. Most of the development of the system, we can store 2.5 times the amount of runoff that the Colorado River watershed delivers. And our cities in the West continue to grow. Phoenix is supposed to grow by 50% by 2050. Nevada, Front Range of Colorado, California, all projected to increase. And we've already outstrapped the supply of water from the Colorado River system. Now we're turning to groundwater sources. Now we are turning to those last perennial streams. I want to leave you with this thought, and this thought is, with continued growth, we will definitely continue to deplete perennial streams throughout the Southwest. We will ultimately turn to alternative water sources. This is a Bureau of Reclamation report from just last year or 2 years ago. They're looking at water bladders from the Columbia River, dragging them down to LA. They're looking at cloud seeding. They're looking at imports through big transcontinental pipelines from the Columbia River and the Snake River down to the Humboldt River in Nevada and down to the Colorado River system. So those things are all on the table. And I guess what I leave you with is we could start to address this issue now while we still have perennial streams that maintain some of their historic attributes. For example, the Yampa River, which is just a gem of a river in the Colorado River system, which has avoided main stem dams, and go to those alternative water sources now. So kind of fast forward 50 years and say, you know what, we are going to out-deplete and we are going to continue to develop these resources. Let's go ahead and protect some of them through in-stream flows, strategic in-stream flows, and develop those alternative water sources now and conserve. So with that, I leave you. Thanks again for the invitation, and